In 1928, George went with his mother back to Romania. And let's talk about that, George.
It was interesting. In 1928, when my mother booked passage with another group from the neighborhood to visit Romania, and I always remember on June the 28th, 1928, we were in New York City during the national election for President of the United States, and I forget the candidates now. The Republican was Hoover at that time, 1922. Herbert Hoover was a Republican who ran against Al Smith of New York City. And we happened to be, when we were about doctor, went to the dock in New York City to leave for Romania. And we went on the we went on a French line, the Ile de France. It was a maiden trip. It was a brand new French ocean line.
It's called the Ile de France?
Ile de France,
Oh,
yeah. And on June 28th of 1928 was its maiden trip. Its first trip from from France to the United States. And we boarded the boat at New York, and I always remember it was in the evening, and the next morning when the boat debarked from New York City, and we were floating toward Europe. I ran up on the deck and just had a wonderful time to see the boat moving, and I ran downstairs and got my mother to come on up, because the boat was, like I said, just leaving the port. And it just so happened, I was up on top deck, waiting for Mother to come up the stairs from the lower deck. And at that time, while I was standing watching for her, a big wave just splashed over, and just soaked her, and I laughed. It was pretty funny, but it was just so she came up, and it was a very smooth trip, and that was in June the 28th, when we left New York City.
How long do you think it took to get there?
Well, at that time, it used to be 8 days or 7 or 8 or 9 days from France. But on this Ile de France, that was the maiden trip, and a prized French possession, and they were always competing with the British Cunard lines. And on this Ile de France, and that maiden trip, we crossed the ocean in 5.5 days. It broke the record. And when we arrived in France, the president of the French country was there, greeted with the band, heralding the coming of the ship. So it was a big occasion for me, the first trip. So we wound up in the English Channel.
Did you think the French president was there to greet you personally, you and your mom?
Well, it looked like it. And anyway, we arrived at France, and they were heralded the fact that they crossed the ocean faster than any other French ocean liner.
And then from there, how did you get to Romania?
Well, from France, it was interesting. We went to the English Channel. Before we arrived in France, we went to the English Channel and docked in Great Britain, because I had some people from. Then we crossed the English Channel into the Havre, France. And at that time, we got the Havre, France, the French government band, and everybody was heralding the vessel because it broke the transatlantic time test. And then from France, from Le Havre, France, where we died, we took a train to Paris. And at that time, the group that we traveled as a group, and that they had, I forget what it was called. So we traveled with the group, in a group and we stayed in, the accommodations was in a gymnasium with partitioned little dorms for all the people, because that was before it became popular for the average person to travel. So we lived in no, just partitions. You could hear all the talks and everything as you walked to the bathroom and so forth. And somebody, in fact, I dropped a glass while I was washing, and you could hear the thing clink. And some French waiter or something was watching by. He said, 5 francs. You know, just yelled 5 francs because he heard the glass break. So I had to kind of clean it up. So
There go the profits.
Yeah. So anyway, so we just lived from France. We took the train to Switzerland, and that was a fascinating trip. And I was looking through as we were riding from France, Paris, to Switzerland, and to watching the farmland and everything that. And I observed and I thought, gee, the French cows look much bigger than American cows. And I was just 28 years old.
No, you were 10.
I did that at
Yeah.
10 years old. And I never thought anything else of that. Cows were being bigger than the American cows. And when I was giving this report when I was in junior high about the cows, and the 2 teachers kind of laughed and said the glass might have been stretching along, it only seemed like they were bigger. Well, in 1950, when I settled in Homer, and a friend of mine had Hereford cows and cattle and Guernseys and so forth, and he bought a Charolais bull. That's a French breed, and to get bigger calves. And so, in order, the reason they were bigger than the United States cows because they had the Charolais. And instead of having Herefords, they had Charolais, and their cattle were much bigger. And the school teachers in the junior high kind of laughed. They said, well, they didn't realize that cows are bigger. They thought that I just said the French cows were bigger than American cows.
So did you tell them they had to be there to see it?
I was making a report because the junior high heard of my trip, so I gave it the assembly my trip to Romania. And these teachers were, watching and talking, and when I made this observation with bigger cows, they kind of smiled. But and I didn't realize that, didn't pay any attention. But when I moved to Homer, many years later, and that's when I found out that their cows were bigger because they're Charolais.
Absolutely. Well, let's go from Switzerland then to Romania. How did you get there?
Well, it's interesting because back at that time, your native dress, even in France at that time, wasn't strictly American suits. They were the smocks and all of that type of deal. But there were few people dressed up. Now we got to Switzerland. All the Swiss people were dressed in their native costumes. And of course the women at the depots were always elaborately dressed. And so you just accepted that, but that was their traditional clothing. Then from Switzerland we went to Austria. Austria had their native dress at the airports. And the people dressed, the women, all there. And then from Austria we went to Hungary, and Hungary to Romania. And each country at that time dressed in their native clothing.
Was it easy enough to get from one country to the other? Was it, you had to stop at the border and show passports and everything?
Well, yeah, at the port they would come through and check your visa or passport. So you became absurd knowledgeable of the see that each country had their native dress at that time. Mm-hmm. Now, years later, the native dress now is it suits American, like every American's dressed at the time. The whole Europe was dressed that way, except a few backwards you have the native dress. But in 28, the country still, the Austrians had a native dress, except for the business people. When a train would arrive in that country, you could just see the clothing change and so forth. In Austria, Hungary, Romania, they all had different clothing.
And then when you got to Romania and you got to your village of Lisa, what did you do there? You met your family members there?
Well, when we got to, well, before we got to Romania, you had to go to a foreign country. You had to go to, so when we got to the Romania, all the way into Austria, your card would change, your coaches would be, French would be dropped, and you got the Austrian coach in Austria. And when you got to Hungary, the Hungary coach of Hungary, and then so each country had their own. When you got the new coaches.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got to Romania, Romania is a poor country, and they just had one class, and that was coach class. And the coach class was just standing room only.
Wow.
And my mother said, and the Romanian cars were all just loaded. I just didn't think, we had about 2 or 3 days in Romania, there were no seats, just, whereas in the other country you had more space and you had room. But anyway, so standing room only, so my mother, being a good merchandiser, talked to the porter, and wound up buying tickets to go first class. And first class, even in Romania, poor country, was really first class. I mean, the bedrooms, it was just living in heaven from what we were accustomed to. But she didn't want to sleep on a coach and standing room and only. So anyway, so she was able to negotiate the changes and talk money,
Which she also did later on in another story that you're going to tell when you're back home in Detroit.
My mother was a tremendous merchandiser. When she lived in Detroit, this is interesting. I was just a small boy. I went to J.L. Hudson's, Crawley Milner's, and she's always shopping prices, And of course, I was just small, I would be running off but she always to see what the price was. So when they were on sale, she knew what she was paying. So she knew how to negotiate prices. Now of course in the big stores you didn't negotiate by price, but in the smaller stores in the cities, you were dealing with the owner of the store, so you go into haggling pricing, and she could do a haggle. I mean, get out, the price. They'd argue until he settled on a price, and she'd know too high. Then they'd come up back and they'd cut the price. So she was a good shopper.
Okay, well, let's go back now to when you arrived in your home city, or your mom and dad's home city of Lisa. Your mom, of course, spoke fluent Romanian, and you knew some too. Did you speak it as well?
I could speak.
All right. So what did you do when you were visiting with the family there?
Well, this is interesting. When we got to Făgăraș, that's the main county seat, to go to Lisa. Now, the only transportation to Lisa, you had to take a carriage, and you had to go through 5 villages, Băcălean, Luțan, Ludușor, Păjorta. So she negotiated for a carriage guy to take us to the village, which was based out of maybe 10 or 15 miles or so. So she got in, and it happened that the guy that she negotiated with for the passage to Lisa from Făgăraș, where the depot was from the village, so she got a price. You always negotiate your prices before you do anything. And then you had to go, and you had one of the carriages. I don't forget how many miles, maybe 10 or 15 miles or more. So we ride, we went to Băcălean, that was the next city. Then from Băcălean, so the carriage guy would go and a trot, and let the horse kind of canter a little bit, and I'd get on and run alongside of the carriage, until we got to the village, after going through 5 different villages. And then when we got to the village, pulled into the courtyard of the homestead. At that time, as you go to these villages, in the beginning, depending on the time of the day. They're in the villages, and they got cattle and the horses, and they got cows and other animals, and they sent them out to graze the meadows to graze, and then when time to come home to work, the animals would come right to their gates. You just a whole stream of cows would come in, the horses would come in, so they got to know their horses and the animals learned really fast where their gates were, because they knew that's where the food.
So it was a very heavy agricultural.
It's all agriculture, yeah. So it's interesting to see. And then the water buffalo was a new breed of. Well, the oxens are. And the water buffalo are those black water buffaloes, but they're stronger, but they're not as pretty as the oxen, you know. The oxen couldn't pull as much as the water buffalo because they were stronger. So my grandfather just didn't like water buffaloes. He just wanted the oxen and cows. And he was, so, well, they're part of the Austro-Hungary influence. He was in the Austrian army conscription there for 2 or 3 years. He had to serve in the army at that time.
That was your father?
Your grandfather.
Your grandfather,
yeah.
okay.
And he was a good horseman. So he had new horses. And so he had a little more education, because when he was in that Austro-Hungary army, you know, they had their strict dress code and cleanliness and so forth. And if he would cite if the peasants would be forced into conscription, so they'd be in the army now, they had it cleaned up like the rules called for it to be. And being a peasant, half of them didn't know about washing up, and if they came in and wash up and they didn't wash themselves, then they'd have somebody come in and take a brick and rub you with like a brush cloth to get your attention. And they got your attention, so the next day you've washed up. So, I mean, you learn the hard way. You don't know, pussyfoot, no, you didn't wash, you just went to wash for him. That was my story my grandfather told me.
And what about the food and stuff when you were there?
Well, it's interesting. We, of course, we're in the courtyard. Cows were coming in, and the oxen, and then they had the black water buffaloes, and I had a black suit on, and black to a water buffalo is just like red as a bull, you know. And as soon as it saw me, it started chasing me, and I had to run around. And my aunt had a pitchfork and just jammed it to break it because it was going to buck me, you know. So you learned that. How to dress with those animals.
The proper dress code around
yeah.
water buffaloes.
That was because I had my suit on. But after that, you had a shirt on, so you know, you're accepted. But black was bred to the buffalo.
What kind of food did you eat when you were there?
Well, it's interesting. They all sat at the table. In a bowl, mamaliga, cornmeal, and milk, you know. They all ate from it. And I looked at them, and my grandfather saw me. And he sensed that I was startled to see them all eat it. So the next day, everybody had a bowl. But see, the family just ate out of one bowl.
So normally they eat out of just one bowl.
One bowl. And,
but the next day
we all had our own dishes. But normally that was a tradition, you had your own bush. But the first, and then the night I had a cot that might be, that's your bed. So I jumped in the bed, and I said, hey, this is straw. That was a mattress. And then the next morning, you're peppered, little bites. They put at you. No seams, you know. See the seam? And after the first day, you're indoctrinated. They don't bother you anymore. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, how long did you stay on that visit?
Around 4 months.
4 months you
Yeah.
stayed there, so you didn't come back till sometime in the fall.
November.
November.
Yeah. Thanksgiving we got home, and my father was, when I called from the depot that we were in Detroit, he was just tickled because he didn't know, he knew we were coming. He was going to see my...
Did you send any letters back and forth while you were there?
No, my father wrote very slim, but my mother didn't read it. I forget how they communicated, but they did get letters, you know.
So you retraced your steps by taking various trains to the border of France or something?
Yeah, well, every border you came to, you change your guards, you got to go visa.
But
And-
coming back then, you ended up at a port, probably in France, and then
Yeah,
took
well,
another steamer
yeah,
across.
So of course, we from Romania went to Budapest. From Budapest, you went to Vienna. From Vienna, you went to Switzerland, and France.
And then you went to the border, maybe Le Havre again,
Le Havre, yeah.
and then took another boat back and
We
back
came
to...
back on a liner, the Paris French liner. It was an older ship, and this was in November. And going across, it was a very gentle trip. And of course, I was always up on the top deck, but coming back in November, they didn't let anybody out on the top deck because the waves, I just happened to follow the crew there and stick my head out. And the ship was something, you could just see the waves, then you're down, and I mean, it was really a rough. Unfortunately, my mother was seasick. Everybody was seasick except me. I was all over the place. And but it was a rough ship coming back. But going was very gentle. Then when going, we on the 4th of July we were in Mid-Atlantic, and of course they celebrated the 4th of July dance at the ocean liner. Of course, I was just watching. I was only 10 years old or 11. In fact, I celebrated my 11th-year-old was 1928 in Romania by October. So we came back in November.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Anything else to add, George?
Well, Lisa is in the Transylvanian Alps, in the foot of the Alps, and it's interesting. And in the fall, well, in November, fall, in the mountains, there are snow-capped mountains in the villages down here. And as the winter got colder, you see snow about a quarter way, halfway, down just each day. And it got pretty cold. But the village was just a small village. A stream ran through it. Beautiful. I mean, houses were kind of shambles, but straw cat thatch roofs, you know.
And have you been back to that village since?
Pardon me?
Since 1928, you also returned back
Oh, yeah.
to visit that village.
We were.
And was it considerably different when you came back
Oh,
to?
definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. Well, in 1928, I remember being in the village. Nobody had any alarm clocks, nobody had any clocks or anything. And I'd be watching people the crack of dawn going to work or wherever the fields were. Everybody were farmers, you know, but the farmers there, you lived in a village for protection, and you had a piece of land here for wheat. Then up in the mountains, you had a stretch where you got your wood for the winter, and you didn't just go cutting. You know, you did segregated lumber, you did cut prudently, so you didn't waste any. You didn't do any wasting. So you really learned that. I remember as I'd stand watching these people, I said, Jesus, what's their life? They have to get up in the morning, go to work, to lay enough, get enough provision to take care of them through the winter. That's their goal in life.
And then when winter set in, everything was covered with snow.
Well, we left in November, and it started to get cold. Of course, we were in the villages. Snow be up in the mountains and keep coming down because the mountains are snow-capped mountains. It's a very, actually this village is a scenic village. Stream coming through, but the houses are all just nothing much.
Okay, well, let's pause now, and we'll move on to our next episode in just a little bit.